Hi everyone. Thank you. Just to introduce the context for our discussion that's going to unfold over the next 55 minutes or so, which will include your contributions and your questions. I just want to position the Django Software Foundation in this, because the Django Software Foundation is key to what's going to work and not work in what we're talking about, which will be the sustainability of open source software, the communities that work in open source software, and how those communities and those sustainabilities can be made successful. So very briefly, what is the Django Software Foundation? Well, it's a very good question. I'm glad you asked me that. The thing is that there are several Django Software Foundations. Maybe you didn't realize that. But they're all important and real in different ways. So we can think of, for example, the Django Software Foundation as a legal entity, or as a governing body, or as a community of people, or as something vaguer, as a political or cultural idea that's out there, that's not just an individual's idea, but that's somehow a shared idea. Now, this is a perfectly normal way of saying that there is more than one thing with a certain name. For example, if you ask me a question about a country, you say Scotland or France, we might come up with similarly a set of various different Scotlands or Frances. So actually, let's think of a country as a legal entity. We could say Germany is a member of the European Union. So as a legal entity, Germany is bound by certain laws, has certain obligations and rights and so on. Or as a community of people, we could say the Netherlands is a rational and pragmatic nation. And now we're describing the values and characteristics of those people and their lives as a society. We can describe a country as a governing body, as a government. And we could say, Britain looks forward to constructive negotiations with its European Union partners. Okay, there's something wrong there. I'm going to have to, let's skip on. Or if we talk about a country as an idea, we could say, as a cultural idea, France, high-speed trains, nuclear power stations, morally ambiguous politicians. This is maybe the place that France occupies in the cultural imagination. And these ideas can be maybe vaguer and harder to pin down than some of the others, but they're also really important. They have a real impact on the way we think about all those other versions of the country or the thing. So these are the four. Think of the Django Software Foundation as a legal entity, as that United States registered corporation that has to answer to the law in certain ways. You can think of it as a community of individuals or people, those people who are members of it, the corporations maybe that are members of it, as a governing body, the board of the DSF that makes the day-to-day decisions, and as an idea, in which case it might be much more up for grabs than we think. So this is a kind of framework for our discussion. So I'm going to stop talking because the sound of my voice gets tiring even to me after a while. I'm going to disconnect this here, and you can put a better backdrop up for us. So if I transfer myself over here, we should introduce ourselves. Perhaps we could start from the right-hand side.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Makarudze. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I'm an organizer of Django Girls Harare, Masvingo, PyCon Zimbabwe, and PyLadies Harare.
I'm Russel Keith-Magee, or apparently any random permutation of those three words. I am a 12-year veteran of the Django core team. I was president of the Django Software Foundation from 2010 to 2015, before I passed off to Frank Wiles. And I was, until recently, the CTO and co-founder of a startup company called TradesCloud, which I'm talking about after lunch, and founder of a project called Beware, which I will be talking about in the lightning talks.
So my name is Erik Romjin. I'm from Amsterdam. I am a Django core developer, DSF member, Django Software Foundation Code of Conduct Committee member, and I do a whole bunch of other things for Django. Used to organize conferences in Amsterdam. That's pretty much it, I think.
I'm Anna Ossowski. I currently work as the Community and Operations Manager of Django REST Framework. And I'm PyCon US Open Spaces Chair. I'm DjangoCon US Diversity Chair. And I run a group called PyLadies Remote.
I'm Daniele Procida. I'm a member of the Django core development team and a board member of the Django Software Foundation. I'm also an open source software contributor. I want to start by asking, actually, I should point something out. Now, in the board of the Django Software Foundation, we have more people called Kenneth than we have women members of the board. But on this panel, we have more people called Anna than anything else. So that's a small step in the right direction, I think. So we need to see more of that in the future.
And
so,
like Kenneth, by the way, but I'm also a Kenneth.
You've got a Kenneth there, so the road is longer than we thought. In open source software, there are some things that we're really good at talking about and some things that we're not very good at talking about. And one of the most difficult topics in open source software is money. And I think perhaps we should start with that because it's the elephant in the room that people don't know how to address. So perhaps someone would talk about, say something, make a comment about some important aspect of our open source relationship with money.
Okay, so I'll kick off. So I have given talks about this sort of general situation a couple of times in the past, and a lot of it for me stems from an accident of history. So the Free Software Foundation, Richard Stallman started back in 1982, 83, very, very firmly attached itself to this word free. Free as in freedom was the sort of the important thing they were trying to put on that, but there's always kind of been this corollary tied to it as free as in money. And the Free Software Foundation has been very, very adamant that free software doesn't necessarily mean free, but they also haven't spent any particular time trying to establish what the financial model behind open source software is, beyond saying, oh, you can just consult, which most of the sort of the obvious answers for what you can do to raise money for open source, effectively the mechanism by which you can generate money is a direct undermining of the way in which you make that money. So for example, if Django is an open source project, Django had very good documentation, was always had generally pretty good documentation. The fact that we had good documentation undermined the ability of Django to get book contracts, to get printed books sold, because publishing companies didn't want to engage with a project that had good documentation because people were just using the free documentation, not buying the book. Similarly, if your consulting company is based around installing a particular complex and configuring a particularly complex piece of software, if your business earns money from selling consulting services to get this software installed, there is a direct economic disincentive to you to ever improve your installation procedures. So what you end up with is this sort of community of people who are writing software that's being used, being the underpinning of now some major companies. But instead of being free as in beer or free as in freedom, it's free as in puppy. It's this thing that was cute and fluffy and you started 5 years ago, but now it's this great hulking behemoth that goes and does number 2 on your rug every now and then and needs to be walked every day and can't be left alone, and if you ever go on a holiday, you've got to take it with you. And that ends up with having all sorts of other side effects. So.
Anna, you work in fundraising, so for open source software. How does that work?
Well, fundraising is a lot of work. Let's start with that. I started, it really is. If you've ever worked in professional fundraising, you know that it's a lot of work. And what I quickly, when I started fundraising for Django REST Framework, I hadn't had a lot of professional experience in fundraising. I've done fundraising for workshops and conferences, but over the course of 4 months, I learned a lot. And fundraising basically is all about relationships. You can't just go and ask people, hey, I have this project, give me money. You have to offer people something in return. It has to be a relationship where both sides benefit from. And so for Django REST Framework, we have something which we call collaborative funding model, and we have several sponsorship plans where sponsors can sign up for a monthly plan to sponsor us every month. We have individual plans and corporate plans, and for each plan you get something in return, whether that's advertising or support. We're currently in the process of revising that funding model and adding more perks for sponsors. But it's a lot of work, and Django REST Framework is at a point where we're fortunate enough that Tom Christie can work on the project full time, and I get to work part-time on the project, but it's still a long process. It's a lot of reaching out to people, a lot of emails, constantly being in conversation with sponsors, yeah.
So we have to put this in economic terms, which is exactly the thing that we're uncomfortable doing, because we've all been taught to use this word free as though it's going to solve problems by being uttered. So you're working part-time for the project, so you represent an economic overhead, a monetary overhead for the project. You've got to earn your keep for the project.
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah, it's an uncomfortable way to put it, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Okay, so we've got to get used to saying some uncomfortable things to each other, because if we were talking about a business that sold a product instead of giving it away free, nobody would give each other a sideways glance and look a bit uncomfortable when that was mentioned, because when I turn up for work, the fact, for example, that I get paid a salary for the benefit that I bring to my employer doesn't make me walk through the door sideways a little bit, you know, I don't want to bring up this topic of money. So do you think that's an emotional barrier or a political barrier, or why is it a barrier? What are we going to have to do to get past that stage? Because is it a question of growing up?
You know, I don't know. I think asking for money is very uncomfortable. When I started fundraising, I had to get over that point that I'm not asking for money for myself, but that I'm asking for a good cause. And Django REST Framework will stay free. The software is free to use, but what we have to consider is that it takes effort to work on that project. There's the code side, which Tom Christie and other people work on. There's the operations and community side that I work on. If we made more money, we could hire other people to work on tickets and stuff. So it's not, it's a lot of work. You can't expect people to put in that time for free. There has to be some sort of funding to make it possible for people to keep such a big project as Django REST Framework, which is widely used, alive. And, well, yes, I raise money and I basically try to make my job sustainable, because the more money I raise, the longer effectively I will be able to work on that project. And it's very uncomfortable to talk about, but I think it's something that we need to just start bringing up, that that's the way it is. But I don't really know how to get over that barrier. I just think maybe we just need to start talking more about it so people get more comfortable with the idea that open source cannot effectively be totally free.
There's an interesting other aspect of that. I mean, going back to your original comment, you were saying that you sell subscriptions and you have to give people something for that. How about you give them a very large open source project they didn't have to pay for the development of? You know, you are giving them something, but they don't value that as something they've been given. And so you end up with this really odd situation where you have pieces of software that are crucial to the underlying, here is a company that has built its entire economic model on the availability of Django as a web framework or Django REST framework as something that is there, that if that piece of software was to stop being maintained, their company would basically collapse. So that economic risk is not something that is ever being factored into the economic planning of these large organisations that are basing their economy on this, partially because of the advertising model, the model that the Free Software Foundation has been pushing, which is that, well, if this code is open, then anybody can fix it. But yeah, anyone can fix it, but that means you've got to put the economic resources into it being fixed. You can't just assume someone is going to fix it for you. So I think there is so this is something that's come about because of the way the Free Software Foundation in particular, but other open source advocacy organisations have pushed things, to say that this isn't a free ride. There is an obligation here that you need to protect your customers from the rest of this as well. And part of that is us as a community presenting the outputs of the open source development process as material that can be consumed by companies. I've had conversations with any number of people when I was with the DSF, saying, "Well, can you sponsor the DSF?" And I say, "What do I get?" "Well, you get Django." That doesn't work because they have to go to their accountant and explain every line item in their budget. And when they go to their line item in their budget, they say, "Well, here's $10,000 we spent on something we could have gotten for free." The accountant looks at them funny. But if you look at them and they say, "Well, okay, here's a $10,000 support contract we've just bought," well, that's fine. That's just what we've got to do. Except that we've told them they don't need a support contract because this wonderful open source community will support the product for them. So we have an onus as a community to package this stuff in a way that businesses can actually buy it without without falling foul of the IRS.
I think there's a bit of a bystander problem also that, if I don't pay money towards Django, it's still going to happen, probably other people will do it. And if we all sit there and think well, someone needs to fund Django, but the other people can do it. The other company is richer. Maybe they will do it. Because it has this optional nature, as you say. It's if I don't pay any money towards Django, then it's still there. I can still use it. So when you actually have to buy things and pay for them and buy commercial licenses, it's very easy. We need this thing. It costs money. We pay for it. But explaining also in organizations, especially we should give money towards this, it would be why? What do we get? Why wouldn't someone else do it? It's surely Instagram is richer. Why aren't they paying? They are now. So I guess everyone just assumes a lot that everyone else will do it, and in the end, there's just no money at all.
This is why we have governments and taxation to provide things like roads and hospitals.
Are you suggesting an open source tax?
Well, weirder things have been, more unusual things have been suggested. I do want to return to this question in a very concrete way at the end of this, but so money makes the world go round, and somehow it's got to make open source software go round. Now, in the last couple of years, my travels to conferences have taken me beyond Europe and the United States. And we've had 3 Python conferences now in Namibia, and you heard Anna's talk yesterday about the first PyCon Zimbabwe last year, which was made possible partly by the Django Software Foundation and many of the members of its community. So at least 2 of those kind of different Django Software Foundations that I mentioned earlier. Money in that context becomes really, really important. So thanks to 1% Club based in Amsterdam, you were able to launch a crowdfunding campaign and raise the funds. What I'd like to ask you, Anna, is how do you see the future of that? Do you think that's sustainable, or do you want to find some other ways of making a financially sustainable Python community and PyCon in your country?
Thank you. I don't think running crowdfunding projects is sustainable for us as a community in running PyCon Zimbabwe, We managed to do that the first time, but I don't think we can continue running crowdfunding projects. I think it would be more sustainable if we could find probably sponsors we can, big sponsors we can work with to support PyCon Zimbabwe. And I was approached yesterday by someone from the community who had some ideas that he was suggesting that as a community in Zimbabwe, probably we could work with him as he mentors us. We develop projects that we can probably put on the market, and then they also help us finance our conference. So I think there is need for us to look for other ways of finding money, not necessarily doing a crowdfunding project, because you do manage to raise money, but it's also a stressful process because you have to keep on marketing the event, and sometimes the money that you get is small amounts of money which end up adding to a big sum of money, but which could actually be the same amount of money that you raise could be easier to raise if you were going to get larger sponsors to finance the conference. So crowdfunding project, I don't think it's actually a sustainable way for us, but yeah, would be open to other ways of raising money to continue running the conference.
We've had some success in the Django world with crowdfunding at different times. So in fact, the Django REST framework project had a successful, I think it was Kickstarter, wasn't it? A successful Kickstarter project. And other developments that have landed in Django itself have also been backed by crowdfunding projects. But each time there's quite a lot of effort that goes into that. People have to work very hard to put the fund into fundraising, because it becomes quite tiresome after a while for the people doing it to maintain this effort to keep it up, and for the people responding. So, Anna, I think that finding continuous streams of funding is, both Annas actually, is going to be key. But in Zimbabwe, where the industry that's present and available and engaged in this kind of activity is a lot less available than it is in Western Europe or the United States. So you're going to have to educate a whole industry into thinking the way, you know, Russell's talking about the problems of educating an industry, but you're going to have to educate them from the very start. So what sort of timescale do you imagine for a country like Zimbabwe to find itself with, for example, a PyCon that can be sustained entirely on Zimbabwean resources?
I would want to be ambitious, maybe, and talk about maybe 5 years. The first PyCon Zimbabwe raised a lot of interest in Zimbabwe, and we discovered a lot of people who are already using Python whom we didn't know about, and we are trying to get other companies, especially in the telecoms industry where they use a lot of data, and are starting to use Python for data science to work with them. So we are hoping that by running maybe more conferences, we'll be able to get the industry to back us and start financing us.
There's also potentially an opportunity there. That yes, that you do have to educate an entire industry, an entire nation's infrastructure about how this works. You also don't have to uneducate them about the way things have been done. So the problem we have in the West is that, well, you've always paid for software, and software has always been expensive. Or in the case of open source, open source has always been free, so what do you mean we've got to pay for it? They don't have to uneducate the industry from any of those sort of notions that are not helpful. You can start from a clean slate.
Erik, do you want to?
I don't really have, this is like a little beyond my expertise.
So, in Australia, where you've been involved with DjangoCon Australia and PyCon Australia for some time now, they were started up, not out of nothing, but they certainly didn't have that roller coaster behind them that the conferences in Europe and the United States
To a
did.
certain extent they did though. The story behind DjangoCon Australia is an interesting one. So DjangoCon Australia is not formally on paper a standalone conference of its own. It's a mini conference that runs under the umbrella of PyCon Australia. And PyCon Australia comes under the umbrella of LinuxConf Australia, which, despite the name, is actually more about open source Australia. It's an accident of history than the actual name. LinuxConf is the sort of the big Australia and New Zealand open source community conference, and it's been hugely financially successful for a very long time. And so, at some point, the organisers of LinuxConf said, "Well, hang on, we have to go through the trouble of organising 4 days worth of a venue. It takes absolutely no effort on our part to make it 5 days worth of venue. So we'll just let smaller subgroups of this community have the room for a day. They organise what the conference is, and we'll just, we'll just provide the venue, and they've just got to organise who's going to turn up." And so there were some Python events that happened under that umbrella, and then that proved the fact that there was an environment for a Python-specific conference in Australia, which in turn became a huge event, which then started having its own mini-conferences for subsets of the Python community, like the Django community and the Internet of Things community and the OpenStack community. So there is an interesting sort of progression as there is this big industry that has discovered that there are sub-industries which can then grow and become bigger, using the resources of the project before, of the larger umbrella, to bootstrap the next step. It's a model that it's been incredibly successful in LinuxConf Australia, and I'd certainly like to see it happen in other communities around the world. So.
I want to go back to talking about something uncomfortable again, because that's my job here. The PyCons in Southern Africa have been a huge success, and to think that when we had the first PyCon in Namibia, there was no Namibian PyCon, no Namibian Python community. It didn't exist. In the first two conferences that we held in Namibia, we didn't actually have Namibian speakers. By the second conference, we had some other African speakers. By the third conference, which was held last month, we had quite a number of Namibian speakers, local speakers, who, since the first conference, had started teaching Python in the university, in schools, using it for their own projects, and so on. So that's proof that you can actually start a community with a conference. Normally the conference is the community's party to celebrate itself. We held the party first, and then the community formed itself as a result. But the uncomfortable thing that becomes really obvious when you're doing things between Africa and the West is an immense economic divide. So what is a reasonable ticket price for a conference? Well, if it's 2 months of a student's disposable income, but it's what you might spend on a meal, then we've got a real problem. I mean, how do you price tickets for this conference? Do you have a price for Africans and a price for Europeans? This is the kind of very uncomfortable question that you get forced to confront face to face. That as Africans start to develop a software industry, and most of Southern Africa is very good at speaking English, so it's quite plausible that in a few years' time, Africans may be rivaling Indians, for example, as offshore developers. Now, it's going to be an unhappy sight if Western corporations are looking for African software developers just because they are cheaper than the Indians, who are cheaper than the European and American software developers. We're going to have to face a lot more uncomfortable questions about economics and inequality before we can pretend that we are a big free community a big happy family of this free software community. So, Anna, you came to that face-to-face, I think, again, once with your fundraising, that the amounts of money you needed to make your conference viable were, in Western terms, very small amounts, weren't they?
Yes, our student ticket was 25 US dollars. Then the individual one was 50 US dollars. But when you work the cost of running the conference for the 2 days, you'd find that $25 was actually not enough to pay for the actual expenses for one person. But when the majority of the people cannot actually afford that $25 for a ticket. So when you are raising money to do a conference and you are saying $25 for a ticket, it seems such a small amount. Yeah, for a meal, like you said, I got the opportunity to attend Django Under the Wood last year in Amsterdam, and the prices for me were actually shocking because in Zimbabwe, you pay for a can of Coca-Cola for $1, then you can actually get it for less than $1. But in Amsterdam, I had to pay like €2. That's $2 something, and it was shocking for me. So when we are talking about the cost, I saw the adverts for PyCon Italy dinner. One person has to pay $50 for one meal. And we are saying our conference for 2 days, the ticket is €50 for one meal. And in Zimbabwe, we are saying $50 for a whole conference. And an individual can't actually afford to pay that. We are trying to marginally price the tickets to be able to cover the cost, but the very small amount that we are trying to charge is not enough. It's something that somebody else cannot actually afford. So that also limits the number of people who can actually attend the conference, and we have to give a lot of financial assistance to the participants. We had actually, I think, we had 59 attendees. We had targeted 60. And of those 59, we only managed to raise, that's $250 in ticket sales. So if you divide that by 50, you realize that whether there were some students' tickets or whatever, but you actually managed to sell 10 tickets. And then the rest of the people, we had to give them financial assistance, because it's either we insisted on making people pay to attend, and then we have like 10 people, or we enable people to attend on a financial assistance, and you give them a free conference ticket for the sake of actually running the conference, because it's better to have 60 people, 50 who haven't paid, than have 10 people. And you are trying to build a community. So you end up having to accommodate a lot of people on financial assistance, not because they really don't want to pay, but because they actually can't afford to pay. Because it's a lot of money, especially if somebody has a family, to think of spending $50 on a conference, and you are actually living below the poverty datum line. You would actually think about your sustenance and the sustenance of your family first before you think of attending a conference. So it's really a big challenge for us as conference organizers. And this year we have we would have wanted to have more Django Girls events, but we have actually had to resort to using Pi Ladies, because at least with Pi Ladies, you just need a free venue, which we have managed to get through Muzinda Hub. Then people just attend, you discuss whatever issues that you have, and there is no talk of money. That at least that way you get people attending, because you don't have tickets, you don't ask for subscriptions, you don't have what. So you meet as a community. But the moment you start talking of organizing a conference or a workshop like Django Girls, which you have to get funding for, you now start getting the headaches of where do I get the money to organize such a workshop. So it makes actually it's difficult for us as community volunteers trying to build a community that you want to do as many events as you can, but the funding is not affordable by the normal average citizen in Zimbabwe. So yeah, that really limits the growth of the community.
There's just one.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, it's obviously on an entirely different scale in terms of the numbers, if only just because it's in the West, you add zeros to everything. But there's a similar thing that goes on essentially at conferences like this, in that there is the disparity between the OzCon style conference, which is a $2,000 a head ticket, versus the PyCon style conference, which is a $300 ticket. The interesting thing is that the $2,000 ticket is actually something that companies are willing to spend because, well, it's $2,000, we just throw it into our marketing budget, here we go, it's a professional development budget. And that $2,000 ticket then gives you a lot of leeway to go do other, community relations and bigger financial assistance programs and what have you. Then there's PyCon US does a similar sort of thing where tickets are basically affordable, but they then also have lots of financial sponsorship and whatnot that enables them to do that financial assistance. So, the model of charge a price that nobody in their right mind would actually buy if it was their own money, but then have financial assistance that lets you develop and grow the community and get people who can't afford that ticket to attend is one that's been demonstrated to work really well on the PyCon sense.
And I guess what you also see more and more is that there's like the split between individual and corporate tickets, so that if your manager wants to know, you just go to corporate ticket price, and they're much higher. We introduced that split in Django Under the Hood the last year. We also played with the idea of just like making the ticket prices much higher to say like, I guess they're now like 180 or something to like 500 or 600, and then just having a much larger financial aid pool. We didn't actually get to do that this year, but if we do it the next time, we definitely want to run some numbers and see on like how would the composition of our attendance change if we raise more prices and give more financial aid.
I just want to raise one more kind of geographical related uncomfortable issue, and that's about not an economic inequality, but an imbalance of power that exists. Power, and by power I mean freedom and access to things. So, if you are a European visitor to a PyCon in Namibia, I use that as an example because I know it, you turn up at the airport and you get your tourist visa, and then you're in the country. If you want to do it the correct way, then you get a business visa, and that's just as easy. And it's easy to get into the country. They welcome you in. Unfortunately, there is a Namibian attendee of this conference who has been stuck in Johannesburg airport since, well, this started on Thursday night. And this is because of visa complications, because it's very difficult for Africans to travel to Europe in a way that it's not difficult for Europeans to travel to Africa. And the vast amount of energy that you must expend in order simply to get to somewhere, not to mention the extra cost of doing so. So think of all the money that was scraped together to bring a Namibian student to this conference in Italy, and think of the amount of energy and money that have simply been lost now as a result of the difficulties that not just Africans, but Africans in particular face in traveling to Europe. And you get an idea of Sarah Peters' talk yesterday was very eloquent, discussing that huge expenditure of energy to get over the bump just to get to the same starting point as everyone else. And I think that those same obstacles exist in other ways. And until you've spent your weekend sending text messages to and from somebody who's spending a second night sleeping in an airport, you don't actually realize quite how difficult it is in practice. So.
And it's interesting exactly how arbitrary it is as well. I mean, I won't for a second pretend that my situation's anywhere near as bad as your Namibian friends, but I keynoted Python Brazil last year, and Brazil for some reason is a country that you need a visa to get in. So in order to get that, I had to put $500 and my passport into a courier satchel, and ship it to the Brazilian embassy, where they went and stuck a bit of paper in there. Also had to fill out a great big application form with 3 photographs and all the rest of it. And it came back, and then, now I've got this visa that I can travel to Brazil and walk in through the front door. The thing that's interesting is that if the conference had been a month earlier, I wouldn't have needed that, because the Olympics was on and they've waived all visa restrictions for the Olympics. So they're willing to do it, It's just they've got this little arbitrary bit of bureaucracy they like to have in place to save them from rampant Australians, which, you know, is a safe thing, I suppose. Diplomatic reciprocity, I see, yes. Yes, fair call. Fair call, yes.
I guess this is also it's going to be hard for us to influence government visa policy. At least I don't know anyone in this community that has that kind of influence. But we can, if you do, then we should talk. But we can definitely build financial aid also in a way that is accessible. So something I've noticed that some financial aid programs do is they say, they give you a grant of, say, $2,000 to get your flight, your hotel, and everything. And they say you will get your money if you show up in person at the conference.
Mm.
If you are unable to enter the country, or if it is for some reason unsafe, or if you are ill, that means you don't get your grant. So people who need that money to travel and have already made the expense, if they randomly reject entry at the border, then yeah, tough luck. And I've argued with a few of these conferences also, especially in the United States, with rather fluid entry requirements that now exist under the current government, which mostly just ignored my concerns, so that was a bit of a shame. But yeah, something like, if you can't enter the country, we will still pay the cost that you made. That's something to make very explicit, I think.
Anna, you've been on the sharp end of this, so what are your experiences?
Okay, I've applied for visa for Amsterdam and in Italy. I've had to do, for each of my visas, I tried to prepare for them in time, 3 months before the event, so that if there are any hassles, I could sort them out, having lots of time to do that. But I've also realized that when conference organizers fund you, normally they give you maybe enough money to cover the travel costs and hotel expenses, but they don't consider that you'll have to pay, there are other costs that you have to pay for, like you have to pay for travel insurance. That's another cost that you have to care for. You also have to pay for the visa application fee and other costs that are associated. So yeah, I think that's something that's not covered mostly by the financial assistance. But I've been fortunate that for the conferences that I've attended, I have had empathic organizers who have actually agreed to pay my travel expenses before for me to make the application, I need to have reserved a ticket. So in Zimbabwe, where we have foreign currency restrictions and I can't afford to pay, sometimes I don't even have the money to pay for the ticket. So they've actually been understanding and paid for the tickets so that I can apply for the visa. So at least I haven't had any losses in paying for a ticket and then be refused entry. But the visa application process, it's stressful and you have to produce a lot of paperwork. And they actually write on when they give you the requirements sheet that even after you've given us everything else, we actually can decide not to give you the visa. And after you're given the visa, you're told it's not an automatic entry permission. You still have to face through customs. When you get at the airport, you have to produce the same paperwork that you have given the embassy. And you might be turned away. So it's a relief when you are finally allowed to go and collect your baggage, because if you don't produce the necessary paperwork, you might be turned away when you're already in Italy or you're already in Amsterdam. So it's really stressful traveling from Africa to Europe or any other continent for us.
The cost one's also interesting with conference timelines. So if you were you buy an airline ticket 4 months in advance, it's a lot cheaper than buying it 2 months in advance. But you don't want to buy your airline ticket before you know you've got a visa. So the sort of the process of RFPs, you find out, yes, okay, I can speak at this conference, but then it's another 6 weeks, 8 weeks before you can even buy the airline ticket, and the price is doubled. So
I think there's a vast amount of hidden effort that people have made to be here. So you're going to see, you'll see some smiling faces that typically won't be white faces at this conference. And they are people who have made a huge effort to be here. Don't underestimate the efforts they've made just to be here with us. So we're really glad you came. I'm going to stop talking about this uncomfortable subject of geographical imbalances and so on and go on to something even more squirming inducing. In the last few conferences in the Django cycle, we've heard actually from Erik and from Russel, who have spoken very movingly and eloquently and frankly about health and mental health. And this is something that open source software developers are even worse at speaking about or even hearing than money. So Erik, you've done a lot of work over the last couple of years here. If open source software is going to be sustainable, that includes sustainable for the human beings who are engaged with it. You talked about this yesterday. In the context of our discussion now, is there something you'd like to add?
I guess like it fits very well into the discussion of money because like so much work in open source gets done in people's free time because people care. And so basically the fact that all that work is free means that it adds a big burden on people's health, on their energy, on their stress level. So basically more work being paid would allow people to do that more as their paid job and not have that health burden.
Yeah, and from just a diversity point of view of getting people involved, you know, if you accept volunteer help from the people who have spare time to volunteer, then basically you're going to get volunteer effort from 18 to 25-year-old white Anglo-Saxon males. Because for our society broadly puts the burden of elder care and youth care on women, shouldn't, but historically has. And as a result, you don't get women contributing, either because of society telling them they can't or because they've got other obligations in their free time. So bringing money into that part of the equation means that instead of just saying, well, okay, who's got free time on a Saturday, you can actually say, no, okay, who actually would like to do this work? And that's a completely different question. And it also then, that plays into the mental health and burnout issue, that if you are, when you are looking after your Free As In Puppy project, if you're trying to do it as a day job, but you're not actually getting paid for it as a day job, and your day job is something else, but the expectations of the community around you are from these large multinational companies with great big budgets telling you that you need to work on the project, and you need to fix this bug, you need to merge my pull request because my multi-billion-dollar company is going to fold if you don't merge this pull request. Even though people will say, well, just walk away from it. Yeah, but I've invested 5 years of my life in this project. I've invested a lot of me in this project. It's not as easy as just walking away. And there's a whole lot of self-doubt that comes into that of, you know, well, if I walk away from this project, well, I cease to be a person because, you know, my personality is that I'm a Django developer and a beware developer, and if I walk away from this, will I just be this annoying person in Perth? I may still be this annoying person in Perth, but yeah, it's not as simple as just walk away from the project. So bringing the money into that equation is one way of putting that box around it and saying, okay, I'm going to work on this 9 to 5, whatever, do a period of time, and I'm going to do what I can. And if I start to reach a point where I can't, well, someone else can pick up that burden and be paid for it. Or if I get lots of interest, then I'll hopefully be able to pay a second person who can help me and share that load. So, yeah, the two issues there, I think, are very closely linked.
I think we also need to start working on more plan Bs, because there's a lot of projects that are maintained by one person, and a lot of projects highly rely on that one person. But what happens if that one person can't do it anymore? I got pretty close to burnout about 2 years ago, and there were a ton of projects that I was involved in, and people actually made it very hard for me to leave, and they made me feel guilty about it because there was no one else there that would have done my job. And so I think we need to get better about finding co-chairs and co-maintainers. We need to write better documentation, so if you need to hand over your project, there is someone else who can do it for you. Yeah. And we all need to consider that we're just humans. So if you have that issue that you really need worked on, and it's the weekend, that project maintainer, he has the right to take his weekend off, or she, or how many days ever they want to take off. Or I think we need to get better about asking people if they're okay. If you notice that someone's constantly working on open source issues on their weekends, or just putting a lot of hours in, ask them if they're okay. And sometimes we all tend to work too much, especially in IT, because we're really passionate about the work we're doing. So just ask people, hey, are you okay? Are you taking enough time off? Just be aware of that. Be aware of your surroundings and your peers.
Yeah, I like what Anna is saying, because also we have a bit of a macho culture in tag of like that. You know, if you are a real serious developer, you work all your weekends. Like if you scroll through Hacker News, it's like half the posts are about if you don't work in your weekends, you're not a real developer, you're not real serious. When I mentioned yesterday that the people calling me a neoliberal emotional jihadist, that was in the context of GitHub used to have, they have like this thing where they show which days you've contributed, and they used to have a thing under there that counted the number of days you had contributed to projects on GitHub without taking a break. And people were like boasting with the number and say, you know, I haven't taken a break in 400 days, which to me is like, that's very, I'm concerned about your health. It's like, it's your choice. And so I was one of the people who complained about it, and one day GitHub removed it, and some people were very upset about that because now their high number was meaningless. But like, I think we have a lot of that in culture that like, you know, you have to be real serious, you have to be hardcore. Like, if you want to work 9 to 5 on development and after that you're done, that should be totally fine.
There's also the succession plan thing that Anna was talking about. We often make the jokes about bus factors in projects. And that's normally given in the context of a bus factor is how many people need to get hit by a bus before the project fails. The catch is that it's quite often, it's not just being hit by a bus. Sometimes the person just gets on the bus. You know, their project takes them somewhere else. They've got a different job and they no longer are working in Python and therefore don't have any time to volunteer to a Django project. That doesn't mean that Django is any less important or this Python project is any less important, but that person's not going to be volunteering anymore. And these large multinational corporations have dependencies and reliances upon those projects. So it's important that we look at those bus factors, not just in a joking sense.
We're going to have to wrap up in a moment. So, Erik, you're can you describe yourself again? Is this your job title?
The neoliberal emotional jihadist. Yeah, I would put it on a shirt, but it's like, it's a little controversial, also like out of context.
Yes, it's true. For the Python UK community, we were recently accused of politically correct hand-wringing bollocks, which is a very lovely image. And I think we're quite happy to accept it in much the same way. I think it's valuable at this point to offer you the chance to ask us a question or actually give us a comment, as long as it's really short, 1 sentence and 1 short sentence. So we're going to take this microphone down to the floor. Does anybody have a comment in them that they'd like to make? Please come up to the front and make your short comment or question into this microphone.
Can I add one more point about the mental health thing?
Yes, please.
While we're so I think another thing that I've learned also is that like I see a lot of things in tech that annoy me, that are broken, that I think are wrong, and I know like sometimes it's easy to like get stuck in a way where you spend a lot of energy on that, but being very selective on like what things can I put my energy in that will actually affect something and which will just lead me to be angrier at people. So yeah, there's like also a bunch of things that I've just stopped talking about because it's like I can do this forever. It's going to take all my energy and accomplish nothing. So it's still a problem, but I just have to let it go and spend my energy where it actually helps.
Very short, please. Very short question. Is that working? Can I just speak loudly? Is that going to be fine? And the mic won't pick it up.
There. I'm just curious, you guys were talking about the costs of running these various conferences. People. And one of the best conferences I've ever been to was, I think it was on a shoestring budget, it maybe cost $50 to run the whole thing. It was held in an abandoned industrial building on the edges of Toronto. The speakers were all local from the community, and it was amazing. Have you given any thought to running these kinds of conferences in areas where it's just, not financially feasible?
I think it depends very much upon the community and the type of conference. Like there's sort of the experience of what are people looking to get. If you're looking to get the all singing, all dancing booths and swag and lanyards and all the rest of it, everything you add to that list adds one more thing. Now, that's not to say you can't have an incredibly good conference that's run on a shoestring, but you have to sacrifice some things in what you get with that.
May I just add briefly there that that's a lovely idea, but it's actually a luxury because it can only happen where there are enough hobbyists with free time. Whereas, for example, in Zimbabwe, Anna has to engage local businesses to create her own community. So she needs to put on the most professional event possible. Yeah. So thank you. Next, please.
So this is possibly a bit of a big topic, but do you have any thoughts on the impact of tech on wider employment with stuff like automation and so on?
I think that's an opportunity for a whole panel in itself.
Fair enough.
All right, thank you, panel, for the great discussion so far. I really enjoyed it. Now, mine more of a comment, actually. Concerning building a real community in Africa, having a Pan-African Python community, I think two things are there. That one of the panel mentioned that collaborated funding model. That's really very cool. I like that and then also capacity building. Now, I'm all for having too many events in Africa, but one thing is training the people to understand how Python really works. And when that happens, the companies in Africa will actually begin to go behind the events now because they know that, okay, we have people who can actually work in our companies now because they've got the skill. Because currently, most companies, bring in experts from the Western world to work with their company. But if they discover that now in Python community in Africa or in Namibia, Nigeria, we have good guys, then they'll be willing to sponsor more conferences because they know that now they can have consultants who can solve their problems in their companies. So two things here. We train more guys to program.
That's not that short. It's a topic for later. This panel has raised and uncovered so many questions. We can't possibly even touch on them now. I think we're being told now that we have to end it here. So I'd like to thank Anna. Sorry? Oh, yes, we'll definitely be available for talking. Please thank Anna, Russel, Erik, and Anna.
Thank you, and sorry for little time for question, but probably this panel deserves a conference in itself because it raised so many issues that it's huge.